Okay, good morning, everyone. Good to see everyone here. I'm Lishan Aklog. I'm Chairman and CEO of PAVmed, and we're really excited to have this workshop today. It's been a great meeting. I was telling folks this is, I think, my fifth consecutive LSI, and they really hit it out of the park. When we talked to Henry and Scott about having this panel, the purpose was really to try to convince folks in emerging medtech companies that it's important to pay attention as to what's going on in DC. Is there anything going on in DC right now? And so we have a great group today. Two CEOs, we'll do the introductions, who are run small companies but are active in AdvaMed. AdvaMed is our largest and most important trade association and is extremely active in helping companies across the spectrum within the industry navigate the landscape that we're facing. And a lot of small company CEOs are just focused on, I got to get my next round, I've got to, got headaches at FDA, and are not really appreciative of sort of the impact that being aware of what's going on from a policy point of view actually matters every day. My ELT, we actually spend 10 minutes every week about what's going on out there. How's the FDA rule on X, Y, and Z going to affect us? And so hopefully we'll convince you that that's something that we should all focus on. And we have some good topics to do so. So I'm going to let my colleagues here introduce themselves. I'll start with Juliana Elstad.
I'm Juliana Elstad. I'm CEO of Vibrato Medical. We are a medical device company. We use ultrasound as a therapy for peripheral vascular disease.
And I'm DeChane Dorsey. I'm the executive director of AdvaMed. AdvaMed is the small company division within AdvaMed. We work with all of our small company members on a range of policy and advocacy issues, and over 70% of AdvaMed's membership are small companies.
So yeah, it's interesting. That's an important statistic, I think, and it's not just the membership. One of the things that struck me when I started getting involved with AdvaMed about just right after we licensed molecular diagnostic technology under USA Diagnostics was they're not just members. They very much focus. There's a lot of attention paid to small companies. I was actually quite struck. I'm quite sure that if you go to pharma, which is the equivalent trade association for the pharma industry or bio, it's not the case. And so Juliana and I have both gotten quite involved, and we both serve on the board. We both serve on this special division that DeChane is the executive director of called AdvaMed Excel. And it's a little bit like Hamilton. We find ourselves in the room where it happens. We're on become on a first name basis. Sometimes it's a bit striking, with many of the large company CEOs, and we have a great understanding. So I'll just start off with that pitch. If you guys, anybody here a member of AdvaMed? Yeah, of course, Ariana. A handful there. So we need more. We need folks to who run small companies to join. AdvaMed Excel does a great job. It's our job. I'm the current chair. Juliana will be the chair next time, to make sure that issues that relate to small companies are being brought to the forefront, and all of the advocacy work that AdvaMed does includes the interest of smaller companies. I don't know if you have any other thoughts about.
Yeah, I think, for us, the benefit, there are three things that is really important. I think first is the community. This is the AdvaMed is the organization where all of us come together. And if you think about it, there are many issues that affect all of us, whether it's FDA, whether it's Medicare, whether it's NIH and grants for small companies. We can work together, and AdvaMed represents that organization that unites people, and it's also a great networking opportunity. It's big companies and small companies working together. And if we as a small business want to have our voice heard, we need to speak up. We need to be involved, because if small companies are not at the table, why should anyone care, right? If we ourselves do not care enough, why should anyone else? So that's why I think, the first thing is networking and community. The second, to me, I think it's very good to be on the forefront of the issues and know what's going on And DeChane and the whole AdvaMed team keeps us very informed. And I can tell you, when you do a pitch to an investor and you think like about your next financing round and so on, an investor starts asking you questions is like, oh, like, did you apply for breakthrough designation? If you can answer like, okay, we did this, and this is what is expected. And by the way, there was hearing about this, and it is expected to be that. You get credibility with those investors. And it helps you in your fundraising efforts as well. And third, I think it's important, innovation, and we'll talk probably later more about it. Reimbursement is a barrier to most innovative companies and technologies. And having a voice of a small company, what it takes, because when you have on average 5.7 years between FDA approval and CMS, for many companies, it's a valley of death. But many politicians do not understand that. They're not in the depths as all of you are. So I think that is another important.
Yeah, we actually have a voice. It's really quite striking. Again, never really expected it when we honestly, our company, we signed up for, I've told this story before, we signed up for AdvaMed as a way to get a discount to the MedTech conference. And so check here if you want to pay, I think it was $400 or $500 at the time. And within weeks, me and my COO were down in DC meeting with, very, high-powered experts on reimbursement, because we had just licensed the technology in an area that we didn't have a lot of experience with. And I just from day one had been amazed at the access we have to folks. I had a colleague of mine who runs a medtech company, small medtech company, that is struggling with the CPT codes right now. There's a battle going on at the AMA, and Tara and her group on the payment group are all over it. And this is not Abbott or some other big company. It's a small company, and it's quite remarkable. And just to give an example of how we have a voice, we'll get into some of the issues on reimbursement when there was an opportunity to actually get in front of Congress and lobby for small companies on behalf of this breakthrough bill that guarantees CMS coverage for breakthrough device companies. They trotted me out to FDA, in front of Congress at the hearing, and I was able to tell that story of why this is important for medtech innovation, why it's important for small companies directly, not through sort of the high-powered, larger company folks. So we're going to try to cover at least 3 areas today, and then we'll leave it open to whatever other folks. So this is intended to be a workshop. I think this is the first year that LSI is doing this. So we're hoping that this can be interactive. I think there are mics around. So yeah, there's a mic there so people can come up and ask questions, and we'll try to keep this as interactive as possible. So we'll definitely cover regulatory, FDA issues, reimbursement issues. There's a lot going on right now with grants, SBIR grants, and other sources of government non-dilutive financing, which is being affected by some of the things that are going on. And then we'll leave it open for other areas. But before that, I just thought maybe, DeChane, maybe you could just touch on a little bit more from, as an executive director at AdvaMed, about the kinds of activities, from advocacy work, from, just maybe a little bit of a flavor of what your team does every day on behalf of this industry.
Sure. Thanks, Lishan. So AdvaMed, as I mentioned earlier, is the small company division. We are what I consider to be a small but mighty team, comprised of basically 3 people. But we work alongside our colleagues in the other divisions and departments to really ensure that our members are getting the full bang for their membership dollar. And what I mean by that is we work to make sure that they are plugged in on all the advocacy and policy issues that are directly impacting their day-to-day operations and helping their products to be viable and to hopefully go from inception to one day the marketplace and into the hands of the patients who need them. I also co-lead our work on women's health and health equity. So all very hot issues these last several years, and issues that we continue to see a lot of evolution and change on, especially under this current administration. One of the things that we work quite closely with our colleagues across departments and divisions on are issues that impact the coverage and payment environment for the small companies, especially because when you go to the Hill, when you go into agencies, people generally will think of med tech and med device, and they will immediately default to very large multinational companies like Edwards and Abbott and Zimmer and Stryker striker. And they don't really fully understand the small company landscape, the small company ecosystem, or how that ecosystem feeds into the M&A pipeline and creates a lot of the technologies that eventually get into the hands of doctors and are impacting patient lives in this current ecosystem. The other thing that we do well is we work with our small companies on what I call small company specific issues. So many of our small companies are heavily reliant on federal grant funding programs. We make sure that those programs are reauthorized. We work with stakeholders and policymakers and legislators to advance reauthorization of programs like SBIR and STTR. We also work with these same folks on issues around taxation policy. So we know a lot of people ran into hurdles when the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which we affectionately call TCJA, modified the R&D expensing provisions in the Internal Revenue Code a few years ago. And that has created tax burdens that were not anticipated by several of our small companies and makes it a little bit harder for them to have that capital available for other use. And now they are paying tax bills with it. So we are working quite heavily on an anticipated tax package to ensure that that change is modified this year and that hopefully in years going forward, if we can't have it made retroactive, that ability to expense when the need occurs and when the expense is incurred instead of amortizing is made available. And then we also have just been working on a lot of issues surrounding investment. A lot of you are here seeking investment because of investment needs, and we work with our companies through a variety of work groups and webinars and other engagements and opportunities with investors at our MedTech conference to make sure that people understand current trends, what the landscape is, and to also connect investors more closely to our member companies in the industry through inviting them not only to our MedTech conference, but also now having established what we call an investor advisory committee, which my colleague Patrick Brennan, who is in the room somewhere, there he is, runs on behalf of AdvaMed. And that's really our opportunity to pull in venture capitalists and other investors who work with portfolio companies to have their portfolio companies plugged in, but also to make sure that we are hearing current relevant information and insights from those investors about how the ecosystem and the environment for investment is changing and what those trickle-down impacts are for our small member companies.
Okay, our pitch is done. So get involved. Get involved with AdvaMed. Sign up for AdvaMed Excel. It's a few $100. I think it's still a few $100. And please get involved. This is, as Juliana said, this is the industry is really a network. It's a family. We can all work together to help each other out. So let's dive in. Let's dive into the weeds. Let's start with regulatory, with FDA related issues. So how many folks here in the room are in some way either planning, active, pre-sub, waiting, some way engaged with FDA right now? Yeah, not a big surprise. How many of you are concerned about some of the things that we're hearing about going on in DC as it relates to staffing, furniture? I think there was a furniture issue this week, right? And other related things. So let's see if we can flesh out sort of what's going on and the AdvaMed's kind of perspective of what's going on, and frankly, what AdvaMed is doing to try to help at that situation. So maybe DeChane, you could start with because that is an immediate concern about the issues around staffing and concerns around the time. How might it affect the review process? How might it affect the time to clearance and things like that?
Absolutely. So I think many of you are probably familiar with a lot of the changes that have been going on via executive order since the new administration took office. And one of those changes happened about 4 weeks ago now, where there were a series of firings of probationary status employees. Why that matters to us is that probationary status employees, for some people it's 1 year, for some people it's 2 years. Probationary status technically does not mean you are new to an agency. It could mean that you were in an agency for many years, got promoted into another position, and now are starting to go through a probationary period as it relates to that new job transition. So in the midst of this, many of you familiar with Medufa? Medufa is the medical device.
Because I didn't know what Medufa was when it sounds like a alphabet soup
thing. It's the
thing.
medical device user fee agreement, and it's negotiated every 3 to 5 years. And what Medufa does is it's an agreement between FDA and manufacturers that's initiated through legislation, and the industry, us, AdvaMed, our member companies, you all, if you are in an organization like AdvaMed, agrees to pay user fees to the FDA. What those user fees are used for is to ensure that FDA has sufficient staff to make sure that when you submit applications, 510K, PMA, otherwise, to FDA, that there are reviewers on staff and on team to do those reviews in a timely and effective and efficient manner. How these user fees work is that we collect user fees from our members. Those funds are then dispersed to the FDA. They then use the funds to independently hire people to take on new tasks and roles within the agency. And this meant, in the context of the last Medufa agreement, which was Medufa 5, FDA brought on several people in the review teams to handle issues that are emerging, like AI, to handle a lot of issues that are currently in OHTs throughout the agency, and then also to staff people for their Total Product Lifecycle Advisory Program, affectionately known as TAP, even though a few letters are missing from the acronym, to help shepherd people through the FDA approval process. So really working with companies directly from the time they have an application in for breakthrough designation all the way through the FDA approval process. And
let's touch on Medufa real quick, because I think that's something that before we move on to what happens at 3 weeks ago, because they're very much intertwined. This actually affects you. So the time it takes to, from a submission, either an FDA days, which is sort of an FDA day is not the same as when the Earth turns around the sun, but or in actual real days, that those numbers that really obviously affect all of us. It affects, if that's unpredictable, it affects the ability of our investors to have confidence in the pathway. And there was something very unique about the last Medufa. Maybe Juliana, talk a little bit about from our perspective how that matters with regard to having some predictability around timelines and investing resources to make sure that they're under certain timelines.
So when you raise capital, your investors, they want certain timelines, they want you to execute. And if you deal with lack of predictability, it doesn't matter how good you are at execution, you need, there are things outside of your control. So to make the FDA process more predictable, there were some milestones and performance metrics that were established. Essentially, AdvaMed and others in negotiating Medufa with FDA said, okay, the industry will pay the users fees for the decision, but we need you, FDA, commit to certain milestones. That included the time for the decision making, that including having the staff. And again, DeChane mentioned briefly, but this probation staff that was laid off and then rehired, these were the people specifically for innovative technologies. Because very often, people who've been with FDA for 20, 30 years, they might not be the best experts on AI or digital health in general, or whatever new, really transformative innovation that all of you guys are working on. So those were the critical people. And it was through Medufa that, we as an industry say okay, we're going to pay the user fees, but we need certain things. And it gave us leverage in all of that. And so then when layoffs happened, as you heard, many of these people were rehired back. And the main reason is because in the Medufa negotiation, it was laid out that if FDA doesn't have appropriate staff, then the funding from the industry, whatever is left, will be a credit against the future fees. So essentially, when FDA realized, and all this efficiency initiative realized they're not going to save any money by laying off these people, that was, the Medufa negotiation that AdvaMed did so masterfully was the force behind to have these people coming back.
And this is all new. Again, if you've been involved in this for more than 3 years, going back 4 or 5 years, that was not true. That there was no accountability, that the FDA had no accountability to the industry. If the industry says, well, I think it's up to $2 billion collectively the industry pays to support FDA activities, it went from about $1 billion to $2 billion. And as part of that increase, for the very first time in the history of the FDA, there is accountability. There are metrics as to what are the timelines. They're focused, I believe, on 510Ks and PMAs, but that's tracked. When, on the board, we get those reports every time we have a board meeting. How's FDA doing with regard to that? They're tracked with regard to the time, as well as with regard to hiring metrics. So it actually became, I don't want to say it was easy, but it was a very straightforward argument when these 200 folks were laid off, to say, you guys are not saving any money here, and you're actually going to lose money because you're not going to hit your target, and we're going to be able to claw back user fees. That would not have happened in Medufa 4, which was 3-4 years ago. So yeah, great. Go ahead, Leslie.
I want to ask because I was not microphone. Because this is, I think, important. One thing that you guys haven't shared. So I was in AdvaMed when Medufa was initially negotiated. And we used to submit a 510K, and it might take a year.
Yeah.
This is real. 18 months for 510K. A PMA easily would take you 2 years. Sure. And so that's really what Medufa did. It transformed that. And so what he's saying is, it took the things, you can get a 510K back now in 90 days if you've done it right and worked for the agency well. So in terms of predictability and investment, it's been transformational. And yes, when all those people got laid off, those of us that have been around for a long time jumped on the phones, were scared to death because nobody wants to go back to that world where it's taking years, right, to get something clear. So I just wanted to make sure that you guys understood when they're talking about these timelines, what that mean, in real timelines. So you're talking about from 90 days to 300 or 450 days. And that's transformational when you're trying to build a business.
Thanks, Leslie. Yeah.
So AdvaMed really made, a difference in a huge way for the industry when they created Medufa.
It's a deep incentive. They're hiring people, and if they don't reach these targets, it's all back. I don't think we had a slide, but we can talk about it. The average right now time, actual days, right? Earth turns around the sun days, not FDA days, is for a 510K is about
138 days.
138 days.
To Leslie's
right?
point, is significantly lower than it used to be, and really does keep FDA aligned with our industry targets, so that we are able to really. Oh, my slide. Yeah. So it keeps FDA on track and really makes sure that industry is getting what they need out of these agreements and are able to really get through that process and get things.
I think for PMAs, it was 300 or so, something like that, which is within the target. So 120 days is basically 30 days above the minimum 90 FDA days. So that includes probably one round of a request for more information. So that's actually pretty reasonable. And again, much better than the dark old days that Leslie was referring to. I'd really love to open it up to anybody so actually, before we get to that, can you talk a little bit about how those folks who were fired were back in 5 days?
Yes.
That's actually not typical of
and my clicker worked that time. So I went to my next slide, which really just shows the OHTs and how they are performing. But if you look at those OHTs on the screen, the OHTs that were most directly impacted by the firings were in vitro diagnostics, digital health, which is contains the radiological health, which also contains the digital health reviewers, and then cardiovascular. So 3 of the OHTs that really see a lot of activity in terms of reviews. How this played out is essentially people were terminated on a Friday evening. Our CEO, Scott Whitaker, eventually sent out something via LinkedIn, and we had touch points within the administration to raise the point that Lishan so eloquently made regarding the fact that you don't save money when you fire people that are working essentially with outside funds funding their salaries. And then there was a re-extension of job offers to some of those persons who were terminated. We still remain not completely sure of how many people have come back. There are other extenuating factors such as requirements for people to return and work in person. During the last several years, as you all know, since COVID, a lot of people started working remotely, and some of these people were hired remotely to work in their reviewer roles. It allowed FDA to really tap into a much more sophisticated skill set of potential employees who were willing to work for the government. I don't know how many of you work for the government, but I was a government employee once upon a time as a lawyer, and they don't make a lot of money, but they do great work. And so remote hiring became a great vehicle, much like if you think about QSBS for attracting talent through a stock offering, but to bring in talent to work at the government. And so some people we suspect will not be returning because of that. But we have understood that many people who had reviews underway have been contacting their reviewers, and many of those people have returned. But
I think the word is that about 85% we think are back, and that was a fairly remarkable, from a timeline point of view, a fairly remarkable switch. I would really be curious if anybody here has an active engagement with FDA has had any particular challenges over the last month or two as it relates to some of this.
We talked about the layoffs and everything, but Jeff Sherm, Bill Marzell, new commissioner. So the leadership has changed.
Correct.
And the last year, I would say, believe it or not, FDA has been friendly. We've been having these interactive conversations. You can have in person now. I'm just kind of curious, is that still the same, or?
Yeah, so we don't know, right? So new commissioner, new secretary, Dr. Tarver is still in the leadership role.
She's still in place.
She was Dr. Sherm's successor.
And, Dr. Marty McCary, who is currently on staff at Hopkins, is the person who is nominated as the incoming commissioner. He's had a couple of confirmation hearings so far. His confirmation is not completely firmed up as of yet. During one of his confirmation hearings, he did express interest in continuing to make sure that FDA was working on things like telehealth. FDA was focused on making sure that they were responsive to industry needs. However, it does remain to be seen. Some of you may be aware that there's a communications freeze that's been in place since very early February. That freeze has started to lift in just the last couple of days, and is our understanding from speaking with our team internally that you can have those conversations again, at least with the staff that is there. So I would encourage people who do have folks at FDA that you have reached out to historically and you had questions about issues to please try to resume those communications. My understanding that people are now, as of this week, actually able to respond. But we are watching that issue very closely, to your point, to see how we can work with the new administrator, the new commissioner in that role, and see how we are able to continue what we think was a really good relationship with FDA and the CDRH team.
I didn't think anyone who's been in this industry a while would think that we would be praising the FDA, but it really is actually, things have gotten quite a bit better with regard to those interactions, and I think folks are hoping that that stays where it is. It's a bit of reading tea leaves, but I think, and maybe both of you can confirm this, I think the general sense is that we are not in the crosshairs. The crosshairs are targeting food, at least at the HHS level, it's targeting food and pharma, and that we, hopefully are, fit a bit within some of the philosophical leanings of the current. Would you agree with that? It's just a bit of tea leaf reading. We don't know for sure, but that's a sense.
I would. And if we wanted to say the same thing about CMS, we've also been monitoring the hearings for Dr. Mehmet Oz, and same thing in his confirmation hearings, he expressed support for ongoing understanding of the role that Medicaid and Medicare play in ensuring the health care of underrepresented populations. He spoke a lot to those topics. He spoke a lot about coverage reform and the ongoing need for coverage reform. So we are hopeful.
So time is right. Let's dive into reimbursement, unless there's anything urgent about, because I realize we're way this is close to the end here. So let's talk about reimbursement. So from the point of view of emerging smaller companies, maybe Juliana, you already sort of hinted at it, could talk about the importance of these efforts around MCIT and TCET and breakthrough bills and all of that, why that's so important for us within the medtech industry.
Well, every investor, when they invest, they want their money back at some point, right? So, and they want it sooner rather than later. And so if you think about it, like FDA process over the last 10 years improved, but CMS process still lacks some predictability, accountability, transparency. And so this is important for all of you investors. They watch it too. There is a reason why AdvaMed has an investor group, because politicians want to hear from investors sometimes, and investors want to know because all the companies are impacted by reimbursement issues. So once you get your FDA approval, if it takes you a long time to be covered, to be paid, that's a problem, right? And if there is uncertainty, even if you are going to get paid, that's a problem. How does that translate? If you think about pharma, biotech, they can do their IPOs way earlier than medtech. Right now, if you're a medtech company, you probably need to be 50 million in revenue to do an IPO, or at least close to that in the near future. While some pharma, biotech can do IPO before FDA approval. Why is that? Because their reimbursement process is more predictable. It's less risky. And that makes a big difference for small companies. Just imagine if you could have access to public markets way earlier. How would that change financing, speed of innovation for medtech, and other things? So I think, again, reimbursement is a big topic. We can talk.
Yeah, let's go through the alphabet soup. So MCIT was introduced in the 2 administrations ago. What's MCIT?
MCIT is the Medicare Coverage for Innovative Technologies legislation. It was really a process whereby a device would get automatic coverage upon receiving FDA approval, which was geared towards expediting the ability of people to get products into the hands of their patients and providers, and also to make the process more predictable.
For breakthrough devices.
For breakthrough devices. That was ultimately rescinded at the start of the Biden administration. Took several years.
Yeah, we got TCET. So
we got TCET, total transitional coverage for emerging technologies, which is still a breakthrough coverage pathway. However, TCET, which was finally finalized last year, had a much more limited set of coverage. It was limited to 5 products per year. And that was based on some numbers that CMS determined to be reasonable given staffing constraints and given the number
really
of
watered it down. It's essentially a lottery, 5 a year. So, I mean, it essentially became a lottery, and it was limited to by OHT, right? They started with, I think, diagnostics, for example, were not included. So it was really watered down from what MCIT was. It essentially was, not that useful for us. The good news is there is some hope that we may go back to the more liberal interpretation of how we encourage reimbursement and drive the kind of transparency that, so maybe a little bit about
Right. Yeah. There is an opportunity potentially to revisit and or resurrect MCIT. And then there has been ongoing activity on what we call the breakthrough legislation bill, which is a bill that's been in Congress and had a lot of bipartisan support last session, but just did not make it across the finish line. But that bill really goes back to a more MCIT-like structure where there are not limitations on the number of products that could come through this automatic coverage pathway program.
I mean, TSET was better than nothing, but it really didn't accomplish what you were hinting at in terms of increasing transparency and predictability.
Look, 5 companies out of the whole industry. None of you investors will believe you will be one of those 5, regardless of what you say, because again, as Lishan said, it's a lottery, right? But I think it's important what DeChane was saying. So right now, as an industry, we pursue dual path. There is a legislative path, which is called Breakthrough Legislation 1691, where it does talk about automatic coverage for technologies that have breakthrough device designation, and that is in the process. And then there is another path through resurrecting MCIT with a lot of talk in the current administration how whatever they did was great and whatever the Biden administration did was not so great. Maybe we can capitalize on that and say, okay, let's go back to MCIT, which was approved in the last 90 days of
So think about that. You got automatic. We were running out of time, so we weren't able to get into the TAP program. But there is an element within FDA right now where there's a interest in pursuing breakthrough device designation, not just so you can brag about it, but it actually has an impact. And if you think of if you knew in advance that okay, we know FDA has told us what we need to get breakthrough clearance through this breakthrough pathway, we know that upon clearance or approval that we will have at least transitional coverage from FDA, from CMS. I mean, that's the landscape that we're trying to accomplish here. And I'm sure, how many folks here are dependent on CMS or other governmental agencies with regard to the reimbursement for their products? It is a lot. I know some people are entering spaces where there's already established reimbursement, but many of us are not. And there's even issues around category. You may be innovating in an area where there isn't a clear category. There's certain diagnostic screening tests, for example, where there is not a category and you're stuck. You may have a great technology that can help patients, that can have an impact that you've demonstrated, but to get CMS reimbursement essentially literally requires an act of Congress because they don't have the statutory authority to actually give you coverage there. And that's also part of this initiative.
Yeah. So as part of AdvaMed work, there is a working group that talks specifically for Excel companies that we meet on a Zoom call every 2 weeks to really discuss the issues that impact small businesses as it relates to reimbursement, so that when DeChane and her colleagues go and advocate on the behalf of the industry, the voice of small companies and the issues that we have with reimbursement policies the way they're right now are properly presented to politicians.
So sadly, we're almost at the end of our time. So I do want to make sure we spend at least a minute or so on federal funding. So again, how many folks here in the room have received SBIR grants or other sources of non-dilutive financing as part of their journey? Yeah, I mean, there's a decent number. Maybe DeChane, if you could give us a quick snapshot. We don't have time to go through in a lot of depth here as to what's going on and the uncertainties around SBIR and other sources.
Quick and dirty on SBIR, STTR reauthorization. So the legislation expires at the end of this fiscal year, and we are currently in the process of working alongside our government affairs team to get that legislation reauthorized. There was a small business committee meeting week before last where there was a lot of bipartisan support, not only for reauthorization of SBIR, STTR, but also for making the program permanent. What that permanency would do would be to make this program permanently locked in place so we wouldn't have the inconsistency or the concerns about reauthorization. There's also some current legislation that Senator Joni Ernst has authored that is also modifying the SBIR program and is talking about potential caps on lifetime numbers of SBIR grants and potential caps on the dollar amounts. We are working closely with our members to get feedback on what those impacts would mean to them, because we know that some companies do rely quite heavily on SBIR. The other thing we've been looking into quite closely are some of the freezes that have been put in place.
Does anybody here have challenges with accessing grants that they already have? Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, this is where we have a survey out, I think, which
We had
shows
a
us-
survey out that showed what those lapses and grant funding would mean for our members. Many people had freeze notices that they received when they put in for disbursements from federal agencies, and those have been cleared up. But right now, a huge point of concern are the NIH changes, which are also problematic, and we're working to resolve those issues.
especially those that are in tranches where you might have already received. We have an NIH grant where we've received half. I'm quite sure we're not going to get the second half. So we've had to navigate that accordingly. And if any of you are actually having those challenges, I would encourage you to contact AdvaMed. I know of some examples of folks who've contacted their through advice from the folks at AdvaMed, contacted their congressmen, senators, so forth, and had actually been able to reverse individual cases where there have been tie-ups. So you get involved in that. That'd be helpful. Unfortunately, I can't believe we already went out of our 40 minutes here, but this has been great. I don't know if you want to do a pitch for the MedTech conference.
MedTech Conference, October 5th through 8th in San Diego.
It's really a great supplement to this conference. This meeting is obviously very much focused on small companies. The MedTech conference is industry-wide. So we have a seat at the table there, but it's an opportunity to engage with larger companies as well as strategics and investors and so forth. And this has really evolved, I think, into very complementary.
And some people ask about FDA leadership and what's the overall feeling. So traditionally, FDA comes to the MedTech conference, and you can hear it directly. Last year, Michelle Tover, who is the commissioner of FDA, she came. She talked about her strategy, like what is important, what are her priorities, and so we anticipate that this year we'll have the same insightful comments and talks.
All right. Thank you all for your time. Really appreciate it. Hopefully this is helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.